As the lyrics in the show tell us, everything was ragtime, but having flown from the UK to New York at this time specifically in order to see this version of the show, was ragtime everything? Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Jo. Hello to you if you are listening to this on podcast platforms. I'm obsessed with all things theatre, and I'm a theatre critic here on social media. I'm usually based in the UK, where I try and see as much theatre as possible, but I also make regular trips right here to New York, where I also try to see as much theatre as possible. And right now, I am here for around 2.5 weeks, specifically at the beginning of November, so that this trip can coincide with a momentous political event taking place here in the United States. I'm talking about the annual gala presentation of Ragtime at New York City Center. Obviously, I'm being facetious, and this politically charged piece of musical theatre is coinciding with a incredibly momentous US election. But this is also a big deal. And it's a big deal for several reasons, not just because it aligns with this possibly landmark moment in American politics that kind of speaks very directly to many of the themes of the show about this place the country was in at the turn of the century just over 100 years ago, and the emancipation both of the African-American community and of women in the United States. Like, this could be a really big week, and to have Ragtime playing at New York City Center underscoring that would be fantastic. But also, this truly is one of the great American musicals. It's one of the great book musicals. I will talk more about why in this review, but I think this score is really top tier. The book, incredible, and the cast that they have assembled for this particular production is incredibly exciting. Now, if you have no idea what this is, it is not a fully staged remounting or revival of the show. This is a semi-staged concert presentation being performed for around 2 weeks between October 30th and November 10th at New York City Center. And this is something that happens throughout the year at this venue, and because they are limited runs, they are always able to gather incredibly starry casts to perform the shows. Many of the shows selected to be performed as part of the Encore series at New York City Center are sort of forgotten shows from yesteryear, and many of them subsequently transfer to Broadway. This increasingly seems to be their business model, staging shows at encores, occasionally reworking the material for a contemporary audience and then transferring them to Broadway. In fact, the currently running Broadway revival of Once Upon a Mattress started life earlier this year at Encores, where I reviewed it. You can go watch that video right here on my channel. So as this has been playing at New York City Center, two questions have been reverberating around the theatre community in Midtown Manhattan. First of all, just how good is Ragtime? And second of all, is it going to transfer to Broadway? I have thoughts about this that may surprise you. I will share them right at the end of this review, but first of all, let me tell you about the show and these performances. Now, if you enjoyed today's review, make sure to subscribe here on YouTube and turn on the notifications so you don't miss any of my upcoming theatrical video content. If you are listening on a podcast platform, make sure to follow me there as well. And if you have a phone in your hand, you can go and find me across social media. I am at MickeyJoTheatre on all of the social media platforms. I am on Instagram, TikTok, and the app formerly known as Twitter. Finally, if you have been lucky enough to see Ragtime at New York City Center, if like me you travelled here specifically to make sure you weren't going to miss this, comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings. And if you've seen Ragtime before in any context, I would love to hear about that as well, because I am a huge fan of this show. Now, let me tell you why. So like I mentioned in my opening there, I think Ragtime one of the greatest book musicals ever written in terms of those collaborative, creative elements in the material. It is based on the novel of the same name by E.L. Doctorow. It first came to the stage in the late 1990s, and it features a score by Ahrens and Flaherty, probably their best work. I'm going to go as far as to say definitely their greatest work. Stephen wrote the music, which is sweeping and emotive and striking and triumphant. Lynn wrote the lyrics, which are profound and meaningful and weighty and poetic and vital. And on top of all of this, you have this incredible, substantial, multifaceted book from the late playwright Terence McNally. And I don't know if we can go as far as to call Ragtime underrated, because I think it is tremendously well respected. It's not staged all that often. It has since been seen again on Broadway in one major Broadway revival. There have been a couple of productions in the UK. It's never really had a big West End presence, but it speaks very specifically to America. So, you know, it has less meaning in the UK, even if British theatregoers like myself would love to see more productions of Ragtime. I first saw this above a pub. The Landor Theatre does not exist anymore, but in a very intimate setting, and this is a grand musical of considerable scale, so that was fascinating. If you would like to know a little bit more about the plot, it is set right around the turn of the 20th century. I think it's the turn of the 20th century when we begin the 20th century. It's 1906 when we begin. Anyway, And we are immediately introduced to a host of characters from conspicuously different walks of life, who will all be brought together by the show's narrative in this melting pot of New York in the early 20th century United States. We are introduced to an Eastern European immigrant named Tate, who is arriving to the United States with his young daughter in pursuit of a better life, along with many other immigrants, including the radical activist Emma Goldman. With the dawning of a new era in music, we meet ragtime musician Coalhouse Walker Jr., as well as Sarah, the young woman who has recently had a relationship with him, and we are also introduced to the white family living in New Rochelle, New York, who will find themselves coming into contact, perhaps unexpectedly, with all of these characters. Peppered into this are a handful of other historical figures who existed at the time, like Harry Houdini, Evelyn Nesbit, the guy who the bank is named after, the one who makes the cars, Henry Ford, JP Morgan, there we go, as well as Booker T. Washington. And as it's beginning to sound, this is a very substantial story about turning points in a nation, about the new birth of a nation that still ultimately would have so far to go, that still does in many ways have so far to go. But despite all of the historic indignities and injustices depicted within ragtime and the racism that it shows and the class disparity that it shows, it's also a story of triumph and success for some of its characters, with some of them becoming wealthy filmmakers, with others just finding and asserting their own independence in a life where they hadn't previously considered that an option to themselves. And much like Les Miserables, it's a remarkable achievement to be able to tell so many different stories simultaneously with such depth and with such nuance. That the character of Sarah, for example, feels as fleshed out and established as she does with relatively sparse material, and that became a Tony Award-winning performance for a young Audra McDonald at the start of a very exciting musical theatre career, is an indication of the strength of this material. And the score is the thing that everyone knows. I like how fantastic that score is. There is in particular a section in the first act where we just have this sequence of so many incredible songs, one after another, all of which are huge and sweeping and of such enormous scale. This begins when Sarah sings this tortured, sorrowful, apologetic lullaby to her young child called Your Daddy's Son, a beautiful song, a song full of despair and loss that goes straight into new music when Sarah is being courted by Coalhouse. That has this triumphant, glorious resolution. We go straight from that into Wheels of a Dream, the standout song of this score, like objectively the greatest song in ragtime, all about the aspirations of this young black couple who can see a bright future for themselves and for their family in despite of the relative precariousness of their position within society and everything that they dream of and that they believe that they are going to achieve. It's heartbreaking but also beautiful and just wonderfully written. And that could be an act break in any other musical, but because it's ragtime, we go straight into The Night That Goldman Spoke at Union Square, which I think is incredibly underrated. And this is the moment that a character called Mother's younger brother, who is part of the white family that I mentioned at the beginning, who has been searching for some sort of meaning in his life, finds himself at an anti-capitalist rally in Union Square, led by the activist Emma Goldman, and he finds himself incredibly moved by the way that she is speaking and the things that she is speaking about. There's a moment in the middle of the song where he believes that she is speaking to him directly, and at the end of the thing, when she says, "I have been waiting for you," it's one of several moments of sort of profound pathos that we find in the show, in which characters express an eerie sort of a foresight, and there's this sense of destiny pulling them together. If I'm being incredibly facetious, I like to joke that Ragtime is actually a superhero origin story musical about the young boy named Edgar, who clearly has psychic abilities because he knows that World War I is going to start before Harry Houdini does. And I haven't really unpacked this even for myself before, but I think much of the beauty of the show arises from its concept and from just looking at this very specific period in time as a moment of ragtime music. This being something that was so indicative of that era, but ultimately fleeting. This was a time that happened and had huge consequence and then passed. And we have to talk about how relevant and resonant it still feels, and not just this week, but in these times. Something like, gosh, the song at the end of the first act, Till We Reach That Day, where Sarah's community are singing for her, and it's the other side of the coin from Wheels of a Dream, where there is this determination to move forwards and to progress onwards, but it doesn't express the same kind of optimism and certainty that there will be positivity and that there will be hope. Completing this trifecta of songs about the state of existence at that time, I guess, for the black community is Make Them Hear You, which Coalhouse sings at the very end of the show. By the time we've headed into the second act, he, as a result of injustices that he has personally experienced and as a result of grief, has been emboldened to become this revolutionary, making demands about things that he is owed, and having been convinced to concede this crusade, he sings to the other men in his company who believed so much in his purpose that they were willing to die for it. He sings a song called Make Them Hear You about, you know, sustaining this message into the future and the legacy of what he had done. And both of those songs, as well as several more messages within this show, feel so incredibly powerful right now. And inevitably, I think, always will, as long as there continues to be strife for marginalised communities, as long as there continues to be racism, as long as there continues to be injustice and brutality. It's one of the great despairs of the world that a story like this continues to feel so necessary, but it's one of the great joys of the artistic world that we have shows like this in order to experience that and remember that and connect to that. So that's Ragtime. Let me tell you now a little bit about this specific presentation and what I thought of it. Now, this is one of my favourite musicals of all time. I am very familiar with the enormous, beautiful original Broadway production, and I had the extraordinary privilege of seeing many of the original Broadway cast reuniting in a one-night-only concert presentation of the show about 18 months ago on behalf of the Entertainment Community Fund. One of the most special nights I've ever experienced in a theatre. I was just enraptured the entire time. And so, given the context of that very special concert going into this one, I don't know if that's something that adjusted my expectations, but it stands to reason that the performances this time around would have a hard time living up to those brilliant originals, the likes of Audra McDonald and Brian Stokes Mitchell and Peter Friedman and everyone else who was part of that company, joined by the wonderful Kelly O'Hara, who was playing the role of Mother, originally played, of course, by the late, great Marin Maisie. And yet, it's the performances in this version of Ragtime that remained the most incredible thing. Stood up to, and then some. They were fantastic. They were remarkable. The production itself, weirdly enough, was not dissimilar to that concert presentation I saw last year, and that was not staged. That was music stands, standing and singing. And this was costumed. The principals were not holding scripts, there were not music stands, there were a couple of set pieces, like they flew in some doorways, there was some light staging, there were some steps, there was a backdrop that changed colours occasionally. But for the most part, this was barely staged. This was, all in all, a concert. It was a celebration of the material and how great it sounded and the wonderful performances and the script. This was not a visual feast. And this is something that sort of varies between different shows at City Centre. Some of them do more aesthetically, some of them do more staging. The likes of Parade, which subsequently transferred to Broadway and won the Tony Award for Best Revival, that had more staging. The long-running version of Chicago, currently on Broadway, started its life at Encores. This version of Ragtime, not so much. Which isn't to say that there weren't some interesting creative choices made by director Leah de Bessonette. For one thing, we started with an upright piano on stage, with the young children Coalhouse Walker III, I guess, and Edgar chasing each other around it, and the show starting with Edgar telling the story of Ragtime and the story of his family and how they all came to be together to his younger brother. This being a pretty bold departure from any previous version of the show I've ever seen. I don't know if it's ever been framed that way before. But as he starts that familiar narration and says, in 1902, father built a house on the crest of the Broadview Avenue Hill in New Rochelle, New York. And the music begins, everything behind him lifts up and reveals this gorgeous, expansive orchestra, and everyone stood together on stage. And this is one of the moments where it becomes more about just celebrating the material and the score and the sound of all of it, rather than giving us a thrilling, sort of completely theatrical production, because just the sudden reveal of all of these different groups, not all of whom have been introduced musically in song yet, felt a little bit premature, but it was what would happen in a concert. And there were a couple of striking visual moments. They had these tall step units that represented the ships both that father was embarking on to go and try to find the North Pole because he's an amateur explorer, because he was a wealthy white man at the turn of the century who was bored, evidently, as well as the ship full of immigrants that Tata and his daughter were arriving on, these two ships passing towards the beginning of the show, representing the change in America that was dawning. To have those two on either side with Caissie Levy as mother in the middle there, the three of them singing Journey On, that's exactly what Ragtime is, and that was a beautiful moment. The various different backdrops that were used throughout the show, there was some emotive use of colour there. It never felt necessarily obviously connected to what was happening on stage. There was one moment of beautiful sunset that was very familiar of the original Ragtime artwork with the purple and the orange in there. And this was just before Back to Before, which is a song in the second act that Mother sings when she is suddenly questioning her status in her own marriage and in her own household, where in her husband's year-long absence while he's been travelling to the North Pole, she has had to take on certain responsibilities and she has learned things about herself and she has come to be independent. More on that later. But as she began to sing Back to Before, we faded from this purple and orange sunset into this bright, bright yellow. And I can only conceive of this being the sunset on her previous life and of her very comfortable, unquestioning marriage to a very opinionated, authoritative, patriarchal husband, and then the bright yellow being sunrise on her new existence. Perhaps that's the most I could take from that. Yellow was a fascinating choice for Back to Before, which canonically I think is happening like in the middle of the night. But it is ultimately this unruly kind of a piece where you have all of these swirling different communities. This is something that we saw in the original staging of the opening number that was reflected also in this one, with this expanded section of instrumental music in the very protracted opening number, where these characters from different backgrounds and cultures find themselves lost amongst each other, unable to reconnect to those who are familiar. And this felt sort of like a production that was most burdened by just making sense of that and just bringing clarity to the stage, and didn't really have the opportunity to go beyond that and deliver any sense of artistic vision or any sense of sort of opinion or perspective on the piece. This Ragtime didn't necessarily feel engineered to say anything new, but perhaps it was the best idea just to let the inherent resonance and timeliness of the material speak for itself. For whatever reason, though, I found myself being the littlest bit unmoved by it until I'd say the final 15 minutes. Thereupon I was a sobbing wreck, understandably, because of where the story takes us and how powerful this music is, and because of Joshua Henry's performance. We're going to talk about the cast, do not worry. But there were moments in the first act that I thought ought to have spoken to me emotionally a little bit more, that we could have gone a little bit further with, that we could have evoked more meaning with. I also think there could have been more people on stage. How often do you get the opportunity for such a limited presentation of a show like this? And this is all about scale and vastness and everyone in New York and everyone flooding into New York and all of these different people and all of these different communities. We could have really filled the extraordinarily large New York City Center stage and had this moment in the opening where there was just an audacious number of people there and the sound would have been massive. There were several moments where it wasn't quite as full vocally as I would like for it to have been, where we were using a divided amount of the overall ensemble. When you had everyone singing together, then it was beautiful, but you could have doubled it and I'd have been delighted. Finally, there was one really interesting creative choice made right at the end of the show. They reprised the song Wheels of a Dream, and as they are singing out these triumphant final chords, on the wheels, it would normally go into of a dream, bom, 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 bom. Beautiful soprano high notes, everyone's sustaining, it sounds glorious, we're crying, we're standing, we're clapping, we're having a lovely time. This time around, for the first time, I heard them make a remarkably different choice, because they went into on the wheels of a, or I can't even remember if they did of a, there was a pause suddenly, and for the first time ever in any production I've ever heard, there was a pause before the final note of the song, and then there was this hushed delivery of the word dream. And it was this fascinating, thoughtful choice. You have to imagine many of the people in attendance were familiar with Ragtime and were thrown by this alternative version of that final moment, and it tinged the whole thing deliberately, I think, with this sort of a melancholia and this sort of a woe. I mean, this was a community of people 100 years ago being aspirational about the future, and here we are with everything that's happening in the world more than 100 years later. So there is sort of a falseness, perhaps, even to singing on the wheels of a dream with such triumph. And it's so interesting to me to colour it instead with that little bit of melancholia. And it forced me to suddenly ask questions about the piece and suddenly consider things and be a little less comforted by the ending of it, which I think is actually very important, is vital perhaps even. So I loved that choice. I don't know if it will be universally popular. I thought it was great. But I haven't spoken yet about the thing that made this really wonderful, which was the astonishing casting. So I'm going to spend a decent amount of time now telling you about each of the fantastic performances. And I would like to begin with Joshua Henry, who was playing Coalhouse Walker Jr. Few can vocally stand anywhere near to Brian Stokes Mitchell, who has one of the most mellifluous, resonant, booming, beautiful voices in the history of musical theatre, and will forever be inseparably linked to this role and to this score. Joshua Henry stands exactly alongside him. He sounded fantastic. I've been following his career for some time. I don't know if I have ever heard Joshua Henry sound any better, and it was clearly incredibly meaningful for him as well to get to play this role, because his emotive, passionate, soul-bearing delivery of Make Them Hear You right at the end of the show that brought him to tears on stage was phenomenal, was an incredible piece of musical theatre singing. And the joy of Coalhouse is the difference between his first and second act. He is so jovial, he is so optimistic, he is so charming and passionate in the first act. He is getting a car, he is building a life, he is going to get his woman, he is going weekend after weekend to visit her, and he is not going to give up. And his spirit and his soul are so broken by what happens in the first act that in the second we meet him as this crushed, brooding, dangerous and determined individual in different ways. And who but Joshua Henry could so well play the charm and the joy and the showmanship of Coalhouse the musician, as well as the threat and the despair and the menace of Coalhouse the vigilante. Now, alongside Mr. Henry, Nichelle Lewis was taking on the role of Sarah. This was originally going to be Joy Woods, and then it was going to be Joaquina Calacango, and then it is Nichelle Lewis. She was most recently seen on Broadway as Dorothy in The Wiz. Another reason why this casting, I think, was quite special. There were many performers in this company who were there both because of their extraordinary talent, but also because their casting said something meaningful and important. I'm not letting you in. You don't have strong feelings about Ragtime at New York City Centre. And audiences already know that Nichelle has this fantastic voice. Here is the thing. It's a very contemporary R&B sort of a voice. She sounded stunning. Sarah Brown Eyes with Joshua in the second act, this being one of the staging moments that I thought definitely needed something a little bit more to evoke real pathos. He is in the midst of all of this turmoil and angst, remembering his first meeting with Sarah. It's a beautiful moment where he reconnects to the memory of her, and the staging really just didn't deliver anything with that, but she sounded great there. I enjoyed her interpretation of Your Daddy's Son. It was a very different one, but I thought it really worked, and there was an incredible stillness to her acting there that I thought was mesmerizing. Where we ran into a little bit of trouble is Wheels of a Dream, just because her voice didn't necessarily correspond to Joshua Henry's. It's not to say that hers is a weaker voice, it's just tonally very different. This was just a question of timbre, really, because his was so resonant and hers is that little bit more contemporary. It's placed in a different way. It's a little more nasal, it's a little more R&B. It wasn't full in the same way. And so as the music ramps up and everything crescendos and they begin to sing together, she just gets a little bit vocally eclipsed. Carrying on, one of the performers I was most excited to see in this production, Caissie Levy as Mother. Truly in her Mother era, having just played Diana in the West End production of Next to Normal, where I had the chance to interview her, and I said, I'm thrilled you're doing Ragtime, I can't wait to come and see you in it, which is the whole reason I'm here, because I can't lie to Caissie Levy. And because I'd seen her in Next to Normal, I already had an inkling about how special this was going to be. And what I love about her Mother is there is that spark of individualism from the beginning. You could play it in such a way that she really wakes to this realization and she had no idea how discontent she was until it occurred to her to feel that way. But with Caissie's performance, there is this longing from the beginning to do a little more, to strive a little further, to be a little more independent. And vocally, of course, she was astonishing. We know she has one of the most fantastic voices, possibly the best rendition of Back to Before I have ever heard in real life with my human ears. The strength of it, the power, the determination, the grit that she brought to it. There was a fury behind her eyes and in her throat that I loved. It was fantastic. The thing with Mother, for me, and I'm so choosy about this material, I feel so precious about this, is I don't know if anyone really can do what Marin Mazzie did with it vocally. And Marin Mazzie, it's worth saying as well, had one of the most remarkable voices because she was known for these belty roles. She was also known for classical roles. And she really sung the first act of the score in this very head voice, legit soprano classical way as she is bidding farewell to her husband and agreeing to carry out all of the tasks that he has requested of her, and she's contemplating the possibility that she might grow as a person. She's singing Journey On, and it's only as we progress towards Back to Before in the second act, which is this triumphant song of declaration, we can never go back to before, and it occurs to her there are so many people out there who are coming into their own independence just like she is. Suddenly, Marin belted the hell out of that song, and Lynn Arendt has joked that Ragtime is a musical about a woman finding her belt as she goes from head voice to chest. Now, when I saw Kelly O'Hara do it, because she has this beautiful, incredible, world-class soprano voice, it was all in a head voice place. And Caissie Levy largely put the whole thing in a chest voice place, with some lighter touches in certain moments. But my preference will always be for that thing that Marin did, where it changes and where the placement of the voice and the strength of the vocal is really dependent on where she is, and there is meaning behind when she belts and when she doesn't. Now, Caissie's husband, the character of Father, was played by Colin Donnell, and it was a little bit of a soft portrayal of Father. The final moments were beautiful, were really well played. I just wanted there to be a little bit more brashness. The whole thing felt a little bit insidious rather than just obnoxious, and he felt like a man who was sort of like quietly crafting his responses to situations rather than just being so flabbergasted by the family and the circumstances that he returned to after going off to the Arctic to find that his wife was caring for a young black child and there was a woman living in the attic and there was a ragtime pianist coming to court her every weekend. I wanted there to be a little more shock there. I wanted it to be a little louder, like I said, a little bit more brash, and instead it was just threatening. It was just that little bit malicious where it sort of made it impossible for us to ever really appreciate the depth that his character finds at the end because he's been so atrocious. On the other end of the political spectrum, you then have Mother's younger brother, who was played by rising star Ben Levi Ross. I have been thoroughly enjoying his career, going to some very exciting places recently. He was so good in The Connector. He was recently seen in Gatsby and American Myth, and so he was fantastic casting for this. Vocally wonderful. He has this brilliant lower range that then just climbs into real strength in his higher register as well. But he's so charming. He is so funny on stage, deeply spirited in his moments of political rebuttal, but had some really great comic delivery of much of his material as well, especially in the early moments of his character arc, where all he cares about is eliciting attention from the vaudeville star and scandalized woman Evelyn Nesbit. She was played by Stephanie Styles, vocally perfect. The character voice, the little squeaks that she was doing as she was doing wee and swinging around on this swing that they are possibly reusing from Parade now that I think of it. Again, very funny, very charming, loved her performance. Now, I spoke about Kohlhaas's journey between the first and the second act. Someone who sort of does this in reverse is Tate, played by Brandon Uranowitz. Brandon, I didn't know until recently, has a very meaningful history with the show, where he was part of the pre-Broadway production as one of the young actors playing Edgar, playing the young boy, and wasn't able to move with the production to Broadway, and carried, he's said publicly, a certain amount of shame and difficulty attached to the show because of that. And so very special, I think, that he gets the chance to do this production, and he's wonderful in it. He's another one who's really been coming into his own recently and has recently become a Tony Award winner. But his Act 1 depiction of poverty and strife and this desperation as he tries to care for his daughter and the interactions that he has with Emma Goldman and the hope that he searches for, or perhaps even feigns for his daughter's benefit among those grueling situations. It's beautiful, it's considerate, there's a gentleness to it, he sounds wonderful, he is so paternal. It's a really beautifully crafted character arc, and we then meet him substantially changed in the second act when his fortunes have vastly improved because he has been part of the dawn of the moving picture, and he is now a director who has given himself a new name and reinvented himself in order to preserve a comfortable and affluent life for his daughter, and he wants to expel from her mind, as he says, every memory of the poverty they experienced previously. And in this new capacity, he is charming, he is whimsical, he is that little bit flamboyant, he is slightly flirtatious with the character of Mother. There's a moment where he repeats, she keeps saying well because she doesn't know what to say, and then he does an impression of it. It's that little bit camp, but he gets away with it. And what I would consider one of the more skippable songs on the cast recording, Don't Hate Me, there's very few of them, Buffalo Nickel, Photoplay, Ink, he turns into a genuine highlight. After which he sings new music with Caissie, which was just beautiful. I also want to mention Matthew Lamb, who was deeply charming as Edgar. I also want to mention John Clay III, who was powerful as Booker T. Washington. But one of my absolute favourite performances, stand out among the entire cast, was Shayna Taub as Emma Goldman. Such brilliant casting. Shayna has played the role before in a previous concert version of Ragtime that I think was done on Ellis Island, actually. And she is currently also starring on Broadway as Alice Paul in the musical Suffs, which, by the way, she also wrote the book, lyrics and score for, and just won 2 Tony Awards for. She has spoken about the inspirations that Ragtime gave her for Suffs, and again, this is another casting moment where it so aligns with her personally and politically, and it allows the themes between those two shows to speak directly to each other. And in doing that and in bringing her into this company, it speaks to a larger story about what these shows can be, about impact and about legacy. It's very meaningful. And after the fact of all of that, she was just wonderful. She was witty, she was angry and impassioned, and oh God, it was a really fun and fantastic performance from Shayna Taub. A joy to see her on stage. I was smiling every single moment. Now, rumours are swirling, as they often do with New York City Centre shows, about the possibility of a Broadway transfer, and maybe that's the reason behind some of the shuffling of the Sarah casting and whatever. I have a slightly surprising take on this. I loved this cast. I love this show. I do not think that this production needs to be on Broadway, because this did not feel like a Broadway revival. This felt like a glorious concert staging of Ragtime. And for us to get this important, impactful, and enduringly relevant musical back on Broadway in 2024 or in 2025, it would need to be in a production that had a real viewpoint, that had a real perspective, that had something to say about why we were doing Ragtime again now, and was not just a semi-staged version where people walk on stage wearing the right outfits and sing the song, and it's glorious, but we're not saying anything with it creatively that hasn't been said before in the original production or in the 2009 Broadway revival, for that matter. And so I say this both because I want for there to be a really creatively strong production of Ragtime, but also because I don't think this one, in terms of its direction, in terms of its design, is necessarily Broadway material. If there's plans to rework it further, then I'm open to the possibility. I love Ragtime. I wouldn't say no to getting to see it again, but I don't think at this time it felt like it was crying out to me for a Broadway transfer. In any case, those have been my thoughts about Ragtime at New York City Centre. I am delighted and thrilled that I made the trip and got to see it and got to hear it and experience it again. It will forever be one of my favourite shows, and this cast was so incredibly special. And I'm hugely grateful to everyone who brought it to the stage for that very memorable theatrical experience. But I'm also very curious to know what you thought. If you saw Ragtime at New York City Centre, comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings, whether you agree or disagree with mine. Let me know as well what you think the standout moment of the show is for you. I know for a lot of people it's Wheels of a Dream, for a lot of people it's Back to Before, before. I roguely think the night that Goldman spoke at Union Square, but also he wanted to say some of my favourite parts of the score, but I need to be careful here because I'll do a loop. I'll start talking about it all over again. I love Ragtime too much. That is everything I have to say. Truly, I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel or follow me on whatever podcast platform you are listening to this on so you don't miss any of my upcoming reviews and other theatrical content. There will be vlogs, there will be interviews, there will be much more to look forward to. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!